I am very excited tonight because I get to do something that I feel like we don't do often enough and dig into an aspect of G.I. Joe that is outside of the real American hero that we talk about so much on Audible Interlude. And we are going to be focusing tonight on something, the Battle Action Force Treasuries, which we'll get into exactly what those are with my guest, Brian Hickey. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Dave. Great to be on here chatting with you. And my favorite subject, vintage Action Force toys and comics. Looking forward to having a good old banter with you tonight.
Well, I hope you're ready to take on the role of like educator because while I know a few things here and there, I know a couple of the characters, the derivatives, but I really want to get into basically growing up with Action Force and what it means to people outside of America. I want this to be a learning experience, not just for me, but for anybody watching or listening. I love the idea of expanding on what we are discovering as this incredible mythology. Before we get to that, though, tell us a little bit about yourself and your relation to Action Force.
Well, I grew up with Action Force toys in the 1980s. And, I suppose like a lot of, guys my age, I kind of got out of toys, went off to college and then kind of in more recent years, kind of got back into the collecting. And my big focus is Star Wars and Action Force, which you can see, behind me. It's and and I suppose in part of that kind of reconnecting with the hobby and reconnecting with collecting, that led on to doing meeting other collectors and then working with a good buddy of mine called Paddy Lennon. We co-created a book or a series of books called Total Action Force, which tells the whole history of the Action Force toys and comics. And those projects led more recently then into working directly with Rebellion, who owned the original artwork and scripts from the Action Force comics from the 1980s, to reprint 3 volumes of those stories in these new treasury size editions, which are just coming out later this month.
And that's what I'm curious about because with rights and licensing and everything else can get so complicated when you have brands that encompass various things because there are problems just within the Joe brand with over the years with names lapsing and having to change and whatever. So seeing these treasuries that seem to present the material as it was originally seen, was there any struggle there, or was it all just cut and dried? They own it. We can do this with it.
Oh no, there's multiple stakeholders involved. So obviously Hasbro are a stakeholder in the Action Force IP, but this material, it dates back to before Hasbro, where Palitoy, they owned Action Force. It was their property. Um, so whatever deal that they struck up with the publisher at that time, which was called IPC Magazines in the 1980s, IPC retained ownership over the artwork and scripts, but Palitoy would have retained ownership over the Action Force IP.
Yeah.
And then in 1986, uh, Palitoy was kind of closing down its sort of design department. It was and it assigned the Action Force brand over to Hasbro UK. And so that IP transferred over to them. And Hasbro in the UK had their own ideas about what they wanted to do with Action Force. So by 1987, it was essentially Action Forces became GI Joe. But in those years from 83 to 86, the comics universe and the Action Force toys was very much a unique Palitoy thing. Um, totally different from GI Joe, completely different from a real American hero. A lot of characters that never crossed over. So the Z Force team, the SAS team, Q Force, Space Force, they never really transferred over to GI Joe. And I know maybe in more recent years, like Larry Hama's brought the Red Shadows into his kind of comic verse, and even the GI Joe Collectors Club, in their kind of comic going back, nearly 10 years ago, there was a few Z Force members kind of, appeared in some of the stories that they produced as well. But I think in the overall sort of GI Joe mythology, the Action Force material hasn't really crossed over. But it's this really exciting, completely separate universe that happened over here in the 1980s.
Well, and that's and most recently we got Quarrel in the
Yeah,
GI Joe classified line, which is a fantastic figure. And again, I'm excited to learn more about these characters. Uh, and that really that is what's exciting right now is with the world being as big and open as it is, and countries being more connected than ever before. These things are really starting to mash up and become relevant to each other in a way that they never were. Years ago, I see you've got a Robo Skull behind you there.
yep,
Years ago, that was this incredibly exotic vehicle. Like, you were as likely to find a moon rock in your yard as you were to be an American and find a Robo Skull. And now we've had Skeletron has offered the Robo Skull Mark II, and anybody can get their hands on that, and people are
yes.
learning about these things as they all kind of get integrated together, and it's very exciting. And again, why I'm so excited about these treasuries and learning more about this completely distinct mythology, which is another thing that I didn't realize is just how much is its own thing, completely removed from GI Joe.
Absolutely. I mean, diving into the history just a little bit, Palitoy and Hasbro were developing their 3 3/4 inch Action Force and GI Joe lines simultaneously, and they were both released in 1982. Palitoy released theirs maybe just a little bit a month earlier than Hasbro. But once Hasbro saw that Palitoy were kind of in that space, they immediately kind of reached out to see if Palitoy wanted to carry the GI Joe line. Palitoy had licensed the 12-inch GI Joe as Action Man, and it was a huge seller. Even in 1982-83, Action Man was performing really, really well. And I suppose Hasbro thought, well, if you guys can do that with the 12-inch GI Joe, what can you do with the 3 3/4 inch GI Joe? So
With the new superstar.
yeah, yeah. And Palatoy said, well, we will take it. We'll take the vehicles, but we want to make them our own. We want to create our own universe. It's got to fit within our own universe. Um, so things like the APC came over, it became the Z Force ATC. The Vamp became the SAS Panther. Um, the HAL became the Laser Exterminator. But because the Joe vehicles they weren't compatible with the Action Force 5 POA figures, so they had to take a couple of the actual Joe figures as well to use them as vehicle drivers.
Mm.
So Snake Eyes became Stalker as part of SAS Force, and he drives the Panther, for example. So with this kind of reinvented Action Force, with this kind of influx of the Hasbro vehicles, alongside classic Palitoy vehicles as well, um, they Palitoy wanted to develop a comics universe, not unlike I suppose what Hasbro had done with A Real American Hero,
Mhm.
and they partnered up with IPC magazines, and they effectively took over what was the leading war comic in the comics market in Britain at the time. So the comic was called Battle. Battle was all World War II stories, mostly. And once Action Force kind of came in there, um, they kind of did a small teaser story initially, but within a few months, it was half the comic was Action Force material, and the sales, which had been slowly declining,
Yeah.
suddenly started to go way, way up, and it was a lifesaver for Battle, and it just gave it another few years of life until Action Force finally left.
Well, what's interesting about that is, in America, we had the Real American Hero cartoon that was massive support for the toy line. Obviously, the comics were huge over here as well, but there was no Action Force cartoon there. The sole media was the comic. So that was did that, and I guess it's hard to compare when neither of us were in the other's countries, but like, was the comic just that kind of phenomenon?
Yeah, the comic was huge. It was huge, and it was my, I mean, it was how I learned more about the toys from the comic than from any other medium. I mean, there were TV commercials for sure for the toys
Mhm.
that we saw, but mostly, new product releases, saw them first in the comic. The Z Force ATC, that's where I saw that in the comic the first time, for the first time, and as soon as I saw it, I knew I had to get that, and I think that was a Christmas present for me. Then, a few months later, which was amazing. I never owned a Robo Skull as a kid. I only got a Robo
No.
Skull as a grown up collector. Um, so that was a grail item for me for decades. So I was in my 40s before I got a Robo Skull.
What kind of status symbol was a Robo Skull when you were a kid? Was that something that, like, the kids who had Robo Skulls were, like, cooler for having them, or was it a little more common than that?
So I didn't know anybody who had a Robo Skull.
Okay, that's kinda what I wanted the answer to be, like, that it was this really even over there, this elusive item.
I mean, there's obviously a lot of or at least there were at one stage a lot of Robo Skulls on the market. You know, say in the early days of eBay. We're going back maybe 20 years or more. Um, and they've all been snapped up now, gone into private collectors' hands. So there's not as much on the market now, but they were much more commonplace to see. Going back quite a while. So there's obviously a lot of them sold that they're out there.
Yeah.
But when I was growing up, I never had one. Nobody on my street had one. But I would see the TV commercial. I would see. I don't actually remember seeing one in the shops. Um, where I lived though wasn't like in the city center or anything like. It's in a
Right.
suburb. We didn't have great retail like where I was
Yeah.
growing up. So I'm sure in the big department stores in the city, there's probably like aisles full of Robo Skulls.
Right, walls of Robo Skulls. Uh, so you said that as most do, you got out of collecting for a few years and then kind of rediscovered it. Do you remember what triggered it? Like, was there a specific find or maybe something you watched or read where you were like, man, I'd like to have that again? Like, what was it that really kicked it back off?
It was actually G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra action figures, seeing them in stores here in Ireland. I wasn't even aware that there was a Rise of Cobra movie coming to cinema. And I was in a I was in a store with my at the time my young son, and he might have only been about 3 or 4, and we saw GI Joe figures. And I hadn't seen GI Joe on a shop shelf in decades, so I was like, oh, I kind of remember this stuff because
Yeah.
Action Force, and when I was getting out of collecting, the Action Force had transformed into GI Joe. It was called GI Joe: The Action Force by the time I was getting out of the hobby in my kind of teens. So seeing them on the shop shelves, I was like, this stuff looks pretty cool. Um, and while I didn't buy stuff right away, it got me kind of thinking about the action figures that I played with and collected when I was a kid. And of course, I think I did buy a couple of pieces, for my son. Um, and seeing him playing with them kind of got me thinking, and nostalgic for my own childhood. So I got on eBay and I picked up a Han Solo and Hoth Battle Gear, one of the first action figures I got back. And then I started looking for Action Force figures. And it just, slowly over the years, it's kind of turned into everything behind
Right.
me here.
Well, and I tend to think of because I've talked about on the show many times my limited tolerance for difference in aesthetics. Like, I couldn't play with Star Wars figures and GI Joe figures together because they just looked too different to me. The articulation was different, but Action Force brought both of those styles together as part of the line, so you didn't even like, that limitation wasn't even a consideration for you. It was like, "Oh, no, these go together. This is
Yeah.
no problem. This is how it's sold and meant to be," and I'm kinda jealous of that because thinking back, like, of being able to just put, like, the Star Wars and the Joes together would have been so much fun to have, eh, to feel like that was a thing, like, that was the proper thing to do.
Oh, I mean, it was great because Action Force was, they were initially sort of 5 POA figures,
Mhm.
same as the Star Wars. It was like I would kind of take my Rebel Endor Commando, and he'd be a member of Z Force.
Yeah.
And then if I was kind of playing a more Star Wars focused game, Z Force could be part of the Endor strike team. So they cross platforms, really really well for me. And then of course Action Force gave us those Joe vehicle drivers, the 11 POA articulated figures. So they just fit with everything else. They didn't seem kind of out of context at all.
Yeah, that's just how it was. It was part of the line. It was part of the dynamic. I love that. Uh, so with these Battle Action Force Treasuries, what was the decision making like? Well, first of all, we've so far I haven't seen the physical copies yet, but I will be reviewing them on the Needless Things YouTube channel. Uh, but just in going through the PDFs, they are gorgeous. What was involved with the restoration there and the I mean, I cannot believe how great they look.
Well, the original artwork for them is kind of scattered to the four winds. A lot of that artwork is kind of in the hands of private collectors now, but really there was thousands of pages of artwork produced for the Action Force strips, and I would say the majority of that is still unaccounted for today.
Wow.
So we were never going to be able to work off original artwork to reproduce them. So and because they were never reprinted in any other form, the only source was the original kind of floppy comics. In fact, I'll just grab one here and just kind of show it
Sure.
on the screen.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you've never seen one of these before, this is what Battle kind of looks like. And it's just a floppy kind of newspaper. It's got a mix of kind of color and black and white pages. So typically what they do is the front cover will be in color. And there's an Action Force story there. The back cover would be in color. And then the center spread would also be in color. But all the other pages would be black and white. So it was a very, kind of cheap form of printing. The paper quality is not really that great. I mean, it kind of degrades and diminishes, very quickly over time.
Sure. I mean, back then, all periodicals like that, comic books, whatever, were thought of as disposable.
Yeah, I mean,
Nobody
people
thought,
they'd read them and then they'd use them to light the fire.
right. Yeah. Yeah, nobody ever thought, well, just really similar to the toys. The people making the toys, the people making the comics weren't thinking 40 years from now people are going to be collecting and obsessing over these. They were thinking these will, with the comics, they'll read them and toss them. And with the toys, 5 years from now, these will be in the trash or in a landfill or whatever the case may be. So it's a weird thing to feel fortunate about, but we are fortunate that this stuff has lasted this long and that we can go back and get it and enjoy it, now that we've got the luxury of collecting.
Well, something a project like this, I think its greatest legacy is being taking that artwork, which exists only in that very disposable format, um, and then getting the chance to. So everything is kind of scanned at super high res. It is painstakingly, every page, every panel, every speech bubble, painstakingly cleaned up and restored. So there was it was a year's worth of work on those 3 volumes, um, and then those high res files, they're now back in Rebellion's archive where they belong. They're safe. They're restored. And of course, the Treasury editions that are printed now, they're printed on a much higher grade paper. So it still has a matte finish to keep it kind of faithful to the look of
Yeah.
the old comics, but the quality of the paper is obviously much better.
Well,
So
and oh, go ahead.
hopefully they'll be around for a long, long time.
And that's what's so exciting about so many of these kinds of projects, whether it's the GI Joe compendium, the Battle Action Force Treasuries. I recently talked to somebody who was restoring a bunch of old horror comics from the
Yes.
pre-Comics Code era. Yes, and because this stuff, if we don't do this, will be lost.
Yeah.
And that's a shame, because this is, yes, it's pop culture, yes, it's what we grew up with, but it is also part of our history.
100%. I mean, that's and as well as that, the creators who worked on those comics were some of the biggest names in British comics at that time. So guys like Jerry Finley Day is the main writer, and if you've heard me on any of the recent kind of podcasts, say over the last 6 months, I've been going on about Jerry Finley Day. He's an unsung hero. He's our Larry Hama. So it's the best
Mm.
way to describe him to, say GI Joe fans in America. Uh, he's ex-military. He brings all of that kind of military knowledge and strategy and tactics into his storytelling. He's a brilliant story writer, and he worked across a whole load of different genres, not just kind of military comics, but sci-fi, and non-war comics as well. And he retired out of comics, very early on, like say in the late '80s. And he what he's been doing since is he writes novels and he writes biographies and things like that. So he's still an active working writer. But his comics legacy that he left behind is it's an incredible body of work. Um, and then you've got the artists who worked on Action Force, the Vanyo brothers, whose line work is amazing. The detailed, is superb. But then you get a guy like Jim Watson, who's got this really gritty kind of, brushstroke effect, um, which tonally it makes the artwork. It's very visceral. It's very aggressive the way he paints it. Very very different to the Vanyo brothers style as well. So it's I suppose it's preserving the legacy of those great creators is another big part of this project for me.
Well, and when going in and restoring or touching up or cleaning up or whatever this artwork, I got to imagine there's a really fine line between making it look how it should look and altering it. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, yeah. You can't say I'm going to fix it, or you can't say I'm going to make it better. It has to be faithful to what it looked like when it was
Right.
printed. Um, and that means if there's a natural blemish in the artwork, so like if the inker is kind of, because these guys were kind of inking very fast, it was like a wet brush. They'd be kind of painting the ink in, and there'd be ink kind of splatter that is probably wasn't meant to be there, but you have to leave that there. That
It's
was just
part of the original.
part of the original, yeah. And even with like all the lettering is all hand lettered. So again, if those kind of sometimes when it would the ink would kind of bleed on almost some of the characters, and the characters would blend into each other. So again, you kind of have to leave that because it was part of how the artwork was created. So that's all part of the legacy.
So for those watching the video version of this on the Needless Things YouTube channel, I've got some pages from those PDFs up on the screen right now, and these vibrant colors, as you said, the art style almost brings a certain aggression or grittiness to this, but the colors are this interesting counterpoint where it is hard military action, like it's a war comic, but it has that hyper reality to it.
What we're looking at here on this particular piece, this is a sample. The Vanyo brothers worked on this. One would pencil and one would ink. And because that they worked, and that's normal in America, right? In American comics, you have a penciler and an inker and a
Mhm.
colorist. But in British comics, typically one artist penciled and inked, did it all together. But the Vanyo brothers were kind of unique in that they kind of shared that task. So that made them very different from in British comics. The colors are done by a guy called John Burns, and who he did almost all of the color artwork for Battle. A brilliant artist in his own right. So this page here is, this is one of my. I mean, I have a lot of favorite pages in these
Sure.
treasury editions, but this is one that I'm a big Z Force fan, so
Mhm.
I particularly love this. And you get the first ever appearance of Quarrel is in one of those panels, and she's in disguise. Um,
Oh, wow. That's wild.
so it's yeah, it's a great example there.
Well, and I think what's so exciting about discovering this is we do have some of the more familiar vehicles. I think maybe not too far back here, there is the HAL, which it escapes me. What is the Action Force version of the HAL?
So it's the enemy. They call it their laser exterminator.
I think it's further back than I thought it was. But so we see the familiar stuff that, as Americans we grew up with, but then these Action Force vehicles, to go back to the page we were on before, and I see these and it's so exciting to me. Like this vehicle up at the top here, the red one. I had
Yeah,
Ben Conway on a few weeks ago to talk about the Robo Skull Mark II. And of course I had to ask him, like, you have to have plans for some of these great other Action Force vehicles, because I'm dying to see some of this stuff in plastic form in front of me.
well, that is the Shadow track up there, and it's the only Red Shadow vehicle that I had as a kid growing up. It's a fantastic vehicle. In fact, I still have one. I've got two of these, in fact, and this is my not my childhood Red Shadow track, but it's one that I was able to pick up, in recent years. I absolutely love this vehicle, and you've got your driver up front. You can have a gunner in the back. Um, it's just a lot of fun. Definitely one of my favorites.
I love it because I'm a big sucker for something that is it's got, it's got a lot of wheels, it's got weaponry, but it also has room to put a bunch of figures in it.
Yes.
Like that to me, well, that's one of the things that you mentioned, the Z Force, and I will say right now, to anybody international listening, I have no idea whether I, as an American, should say Z Force or Z Force. No clue. I do not know what's appropriate. But people in the comments will for sure correct me. Um, but you mentioned the what we knew as the APC, which I believe the Z Force. I'm just going to say Z Force. I don't want to tread on international toes.
Well,
Uh,
I love that you brought that up, right? Because in one of the stories in volume 3 of the Treasury editions, which is the Z Force focused volume, there's a particular story where there's an American character and he calls them Z Force, and it's written phonetically ZEE, and the enemy referred to them as Z Force, ZED. So the writer clearly back in the 1980s was picking up on those kind of yeah, dialect variations and working
right.
that into the script.
Oh, that's great. I love that. Um, so the version of our American APC is the Z Force one. Is that an all green one, or is that something different that I'm thinking of?
It's all green. It's
Okay,
green.
that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that's so exciting to me. It just seems so cool. Like I know this, but look at this different take on it, this different variation. Uh, the vehicles are definitely what caught my eye first, but then to get into these characters, that there are, these parallels like Gaucho, Quarrel, um, Slammer, who Stalker over here. Is that right?
Stalker. He's Jammer. Jammer in Z
Jammer.
Force.
I was close. I was close. Uh, so to get to these different characterizations, I'm very excited to dig into these and really like get into these stories.
So
Uh,
I was
what?
actually having a conversation with somebody there earlier this week, and we were talking about the character of Red Jackal, and Red Jackal is, you'll know him as Destro. It's the
Yes.
Destro action figure, but he's he's got no connection to Destro from the G.I. Joe universe whatsoever. He was a former Action Force member. He was a vehicle driver. He was ambushed, left for dead, and he's effectively a cyborg. Baron Ironblood operates on him. It's kind of like, think about what happens to RoboCop, the way he kind of just gets, he's more machine now than man, even though that's a Star Wars quote.
Well,
But
but it
that's
makes sense
essentially
with
Red Jackal.
the metal head. Like, that's a sensible interpretation of Destro's look, you know?
Yeah, yeah, totally. And his origin story is a pretty bleak story, because it's one where the bad guys come out on top, and that happens a bit in the Action Force universe. The bad guys, they have their victories. They have a lot of defeats as well, but when they have their victories, it can get dark.
Well, and that's interesting because the sort of the trademark of Larry Hama's narrative as it went on was, Cobra being the ongoing threat. The Joes would win at the end of the issue, but then Cobra Commander would say, yes, but that's part of my plan. Now we move on to the real, like there was always this rolling, Cobra Commander was always a little ahead of things. I like the idea that there actually were victories on either side, presenting a more realistic conflict.
Oh, that is a trademark of the the writers in Battle. Like, Battle as a comic, its overall reputation was that it was gritty, it was hard hitting. They weren't going to pull their punches when it came to the violence. And I'm going to say, some of those stories in Battle, when I was reading them as a kid, they were too heavy for me. Like, there's a story called Charlie's War. It's a World War One story, and that was running in parallel with the Action Force material. I couldn't read Charlie's War as a kid. I love it now. It's a masterpiece, and it's, but highly recommended. But at the time, it was so dark, I would have to skip that one. So while they toned things down a little bit for Action Force, they didn't tone it down that much. So you've got those kind of darker stories where the bad guys come out on top. You've got bodies being blown to bits in explosions, being riddled with bullets. Like, it's pretty full on when it comes to the violence and the action for what was a kid's comic. When we were working on our Total Action Force, the history of Action Force, we interviewed the editor from Battle, and he said that the only brief that they got from Palatoy was to not have bodies being blown apart. Well, that probably only lasted for a couple of issues, and then it just rolled in with the rest of the comic. So,
well, Palatoy realized, look, if like after it started happening, they were like, well, wait a minute, if they're seeing bodies being blown apart, maybe the kids will pull the figures apart and then have to buy new figures, and that'll make us more money.
maybe
It's all business.
maybe.
So you had mentioned that Jerry Finley Day left comics in, I think you said, the late 80s, and had moved on to novels. And have you had an opportunity to interact with him at all? Like, does he have an awareness of the impact that his early work had on a generation?
Oh yeah. I mean, he's still, like, Jerry will still do conventions. He'll do comic
Okay.
book signings, things like that. So he still engaged with the comic fans, even though he's not writing any new comic material. And for these books, I mean, Jerry was very gracious. I was able to interview him a couple of times, and he also wrote an introduction, which is featured in Volume 1. So that was really nice to kind of get that, kind of input from Jerry into these volumes. And he does have a set of the book, so I shipped a set out to him. So I'm hoping to meet Jerry in person at an event later this year. So yeah, I'll be doing the convention circuit here in Ireland and the UK, and hopefully talking Battle Action Force with a lot of people at those shows. So and if myself and Jerry's paths get to cross, it'll be great, because we've only spoken kind of on the telephone.
Right.
It'll be nice to sit down and have a chat with him in person, and you know, uh, just it's just kind of that kind of meet and greet at a convention. Maybe I'll buy him a beer. I don't even know if he drinks beer, but if he does, whatever he drinks, I'll get him one of those.
Right, absolutely. I want to make sure I've got my crawl at the bottom of the screen for the viewers that are watching correct. In the United States, if you would like to order these treasuries, they are available from skeletron.com, who, from what I understand, have been partners in this to an
Oh yeah.
extent.
Skeletron are a huge part of this project. So these treasury editions, they're co-published by Total Toy Books, which is my business, Rebellion Publishing, and Skeletron. So it's a three-way effort to get these books out there. And one of the big roles that, I mean, obviously a huge role that Skeletron fulfilled in this project, but one of the big roles is that they're holding stock in North America in their distribution center, which means that we can get books to readers in America at a really fantastic shipping rate, because if you order one book is about 2.5 kilos,
Yeah.
maybe 3 kilos packed. I don't know what that converts to in pounds, but 3 books is 7 kilos packed, and that's about £15, I think. So it would be very costly to ship from Ireland to North America, but with Skeletron on board, we can get those books shipped really cost effectively and quickly too. So it's much quicker going from Skeletron's fulfillment center. So the guys in Skeletron, they've got the books up on their website, and of course, if you're on my side of the Atlantic, totaltoybooks.com, we've got our facility here in Ireland, which services Ireland, UK, and Europe. It also has we've got distribute. We can ship to the rest of the world as well, but once you get outside of Europe, those shipping rates tend to
Yeah.
to go up.
So, you had mentioned that one of the pages we brought up before was one of your favorites. Are there any specific, like, let's say somebody was grabbing just one of the treasuries just to kind of test drive it? Myself, with my specific needs that I kind of mentioned before, with not crossing the different kinds of figures, I would have to start with number one. But if somebody just wants to grab one of them, do you need to start with number one, or would you be okay? Like, how linear are the stories, or could you just pick a different volume?
I think you could dive into any of the volumes first, but these particular stories are curated in a certain way that they try to capture the core continuity for the Red Shadows era of Action Force. So the very first appearance of Baron Ironblood on the sort of on a global scale is that first Action Force story where he invades and captures an island off the coast of South America, holds it to ransom, and Action Force have to assemble to go in and liberate the island. And that incident sparks a chain of events then that lead into the one of the first long-running stories, which is called Operation Bloodhound, where an Action Force strike team, essentially have to pursue Baron Ironblood around the different locations around the continent of South America, and eventually they end up becoming the hunted, and Baron Ironblood is the one chasing them. So that's that kind of that's the Operation Bloodhound is the story that kind of really just kickstarts the whole thing off in the comics universe. So that's all collected in volume 1. But if you were to dive into volumes 2 or 3 first, there's enough context in there to kind of get you up to speed on kind of what's happening. But the way I see it is that volume 1 is very much a Red Shadows kind of centric volume. Volume 3 is very much a Z Force centric volume. And then volume 2, you get a little bit of everything in volume 2. So if you want a bit of Q Force, Z Force, SAS Force, volume 2 is kind of, it would be a better all-rounder.
Oh, cool. I like having that breakdown. It's good to and again, anybody who wants to check out these websites, skeletron.com in the US, totaltoybooks.com internationally. Go just I mean, we all know how to use Google now. Do some research, check out just some of the history involved with this. it's a very exciting thing, and it's always nice. I think it's easier to dip into something new when there are elements of something familiar in it. Matter of fact, that I would say that's all of our pop culture now goes by that very strongly, considering all the sequels and remakes and whatever else. So if you're a fan of real American hero GI Joe, you've got you're gonna like the flavor of Action Force, I think.
I think so. It's not going to retread ground that you're familiar with. It's going to offer a very different perspective on some things will be familiar. Like most real American hero fans will know of the Red Shadows, thanks to Larry Hama. Um, so there'll be some familiarity there, but really tonally, and when I say tonally, not just the visual tone or aesthetic, but also the tone of how it's written, it'll give you a very different perspective on these comics. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because is because of the weekly format, and because you had multiple stories in the comic. So if we take this as an example, you've got 32 pages here, but you've got 7 stories in there in your 32 pages. So this Action Force story on the back page, there's only 3 pages for that story. And in those 3 pages, the writer and the artist has to make it really dramatic, really fast paced. It's a cliffhanger. It's got to pull you back next week to get the next part of the story. Whereas compared to a real American hero comic, you might have 20 plus pages of story.
Right.
So the writer and the artist, they don't have that same kind of intensity. They can still have a cliffhanger ending at the end, but over the course of 20 pages, it's a different kind of pace is needed to make those 20 pages work and to keep you engaged compared to 3 pages in a story. Some stories might have had 5 pages, but it varied. But so that kind of fast pace, their stories are very fast paced. They're full on action. It is an edge of the seat kind of ride as you're going through a whole story. Like this cliffhanger is every 3 pages, but thankfully you don't have to wait a week to collect the comics over like
Yeah.
9 months. You can pick up volume 1 and you've got 9-10 months of Action Force material in 1 volume.
Well, and I like that. I like the idea of these smaller segmented stories. What I believe the producers of content now call snackable content. You can sit down, read a few pages, do something else. Like it's a perfect little diversion for a little while. But then if you get sucked in, you sit down, you read the whole thing. Like it does give you an option to kind of focus your attention a little bit differently than full form like American comics do.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've got a couple of questions here from some of our members on the Needless Things YouTube channel. When I put up that I was going to be interviewing you, I put out a call if anybody has any specific questions. And Joey Gambrell says, as someone still learning about all things G.I. Joe, can you explain how Battle Action Force fits into G.I. Joe? And you know what? I think over the course of this episode, we've pretty much done that. But are there any, because we know that Action Force did start off as if very much its own thing. When you were watching it happen back then, sort of seeing G.I. Joe slowly become maybe a bigger part of things, was it apparent to you? Like, did you see, oh, this American thing is kind of taking over this thing we love? Or was it just like, no, this is what it is?
Yeah, that latter situation there, because we weren't aware of that there was a completely different toy
Right.
line in America. We had no idea. So we just, Palatoy made all the toys that we played with, boys and girls toys. It was a huge brand, growing up. So we just saw Palatoy on the product. It just, they were making it as far as we were concerned, and we just accepted it, and it just fed naturally into the whole toy line as well as the mythology. I will say the way they did we call it a crossover is not the right term, but that transformation as
Mhm.
they filtered in the Joe and Cobra characters. And I won't get too. I don't want to kind of spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it,
Yeah, right,
but
right.
it's now we don't these three volumes don't handle the actual kind of transfer into the Joe era of Action Force. They stop just at the end of the Red Shadows era. But and the plan would be that future volumes would cover that kind of
Yeah.
changeover. But the way the writers planned it out, the way they kind of retconned in these new characters, and they didn't all just appear all at once. They were slowly introduced over a whole series of issues, and then all of a sudden, without even realizing it, they were just part of the fabric of Action Force. And and I think we got some of our some amazing stories in that kind of in my mind it's like the Red Shadows era and the Cobra era, and the quality, they had amazing quality in the Red Shadows era, and that continued into the Cobra era. It wasn't diminished in any way
Yeah.
with that kind of changeover. It was still an amazing, fantastic universe of stories.
Oh, that's good to know. I like hearing that. I'm gonna throw my own thing in here, and this may be way out of your wheelhouse. I don't know, but I'm always very curious about this. So, uh, when I was well, to this day, another one of my passions is Doctor Who. And
Oh
when
yeah,
I was a kid, uh, there was a special that I don't is Doctor Who at all in your realm
oh
of
yeah,
interest?
we had Doctor Who. Well, I only remember from when I was growing up, so like in the '70s and early
Yeah.
'80s. Tom Baker, he's my Doctor Who.
Mine as well. The first time I ever saw Doctor Who was when the Five Doctors special was actually broadcast on
Yeah.
Thanksgiving Day here in the US. I was 7 years old at my aunt and uncle's for Thanksgiving dinner, and I don't want to hang out with these old people, so I went in the back bedroom and came in the middle of that and just loved it. And then a
Wow.
couple of years later, uh, we've got our public broadcasting service over here, PBS, that is where Doctor Who aired late Saturday nights. Perfect time for because to me it was almost a horror show.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Oh
but
god, yeah.
the Terror of the Zygons with Tom Baker with the Loch Ness monster was the first episode I saw on like regularly on television when I discovered it was a thing that I could just watch on a regular basis. And when I was a kid, there are no Doctor Who toys in America. Obviously, most Americans don't even. I try to talk to people about Doctor Who, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" But then, as I get older, I become aware of the. Is it Daypol? I
Oh
think is the
god.
company that did the Doctor Who toys. So, but what I'm getting to is Action Force, Doctor Who, toy wise. Where are they battling it out? Like, which one is the bigger
Ooh.
property?
Well, oh god, that's a tough question.
Oh, good,
Because
I'm glad it is.
I know that there are hardcore Doctor Who fans
Mhm.
um, over here, like hardcore, and there's as many. I would say as a fandom, there's probably a bigger Doctor Who community than there is an Action Force community. Because Doctor Who had the TV reach.
Right.
He was on TV every week, and it was a hit show. But certainly when I was growing up, it was a massive, massive show. Um, Palatoy also produced Doctor Who material. One of a grail piece that I would love to have in my collection is a Palatoy Dalek. I don't have one, but it's one that I want to get. They're very hard to come by.
Mhm.
Um, the Cybermen freaked me out when I was growing up. That I was terrified of the Cybermen.
Yep.
Um, but
Well,
and
that's the scene in The Five Doctors where that android kills the Cyberman it terrified me, but I was just enthralled. But yeah, the Cybermen always freaked me out too. Any kind of, it's funny. We go back to Red Jackal, we go back to RoboCop, we go back to the Cybermen. Any kind of like cyborg type thing is always a little creepy to me.
oh god, yeah, totally.
All right, we've got one more, and then we'll wrap things up here. From Wreck Ship 85, and this may be outside of your realm of knowledge, or you may not be able to answer it. Is Skybound, who is currently producing the new GI Joe comics and the Energon universe stuff, is Skybound able to use any of the classic Action Force characters like Baron Ironblood or Red Jackal or any of the Red Shadows in general?
I mean, obviously, I don't know the deal or the license that Skybound have, but if I was speculating, I'm going to speculate, I couldn't see why not. If we can see, Quarrel and the Red
Right.
Shadows and the Black Major crop up in the GI Joe universe, um, I'm pretty sure that the GI Joe Collectors Club, which in their licensed kind of magazine, they had stories that had Space Force and Z Force in there as well. So why couldn't Skybound, tap into that Action Force universe as well, and bring some of those characters out there? I mean, Hasbro, the IP is theirs. They inherited that. Well, they didn't inherit it. It was assigned directly over to them in 1986. So they got it back in 86, and then they later in the 90s acquired Palatoy anyway. So they so that ownership is crystal clear.
Yeah.
There's a precedent there for Action Force characters appearing in the GI Joe universe. And if Skybound were to bring but I'm already full on board with the Energon universe anyway in terms of my comic collecting.
Yeah.
So if they introduced Action Force characters as well, that's just the cream on the icing on the cake.
Here's my, I'm going to throw this prediction out there for anybody listening, anybody watching right now. You heard it here first on the Needless Things YouTube channel. Dave West predicts in the year 2030 we will get a Transformers crossover Robo Skull
Oh yes,
that transforms into the Galvatron or something. I don't know, but oh man, the
that would be cool.
possibilities are amazing. Brian, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel enlightened about this, and I'm more excited than ever about receiving those Treasury editions and really digging into them. Before we go, is there anything else you'd like to share about Action Force, about the Treasuries specifically?
But I'm so excited to have these books, to finally have them kind of coming out there. We ran a big pre-order there in the latter half of 2024. So all the people who pre-ordered those books have been shipped to them before Christmas, and everybody has received their books. The but the retail release isn't due to happen until the 22nd of January. So I don't know what time this show is going to be out there, but 22nd of January, and those books will be in select stores. And if you want to see the Battle Action Force Treasury editions in your comic book store, simply ask your local comic book store to order them in from their distributor, and and enjoy reading those books.
And I will say this: if obviously go to skeletron.com, order your copies internationally. Go to totaltoybooks.com. But if you go to your local comic shop, maybe you're drawing their attention to this thing. Maybe it's something that they hadn't really thought about, and they see this and they think, you know what? I'm going to order one for them, but let me order one to keep in the store too. Like there can be benefits for the brand to go into your local comic shop. So I always recommend make that your first stop. But if you just can't wait, if you got to get it right now, then those are the two websites to go to.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Brian, this has been absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, Dave, thank you so much, and looking forward to coming back in the future and talking GI Joe and Action Force with you again. Thank you.
Absolutely. As we get into these things, we're going to be hitting you up to talk about these stories in the future. So yeah, we absolutely love to have you back on.
Brilliant, brilliant. My pleasure. Cheers, Dave.
Thanks, man. Hey, Phantomaniacs, I want to tell you about memberships for the Needless Things channel. We have 3 different levels. Each one has different special perks that will only be available to members. We've got things like special emojis that I made myself, badges, polls that you're going to be able to participate in to determine what we do here on the channel, early access to videos, exclusive live chats, exclusive live streams, lots of engagement, because that's really what I want. I really enjoy the comments here on the channel, even the negative ones. I like getting into that kind of stuff, and I want people to feel like they're more a part of what's going on here. And obviously, I want support for the channel. You know, this stuff, as much as I love doing it and providing it for free, it isn't free for me. So every little bit that we can get helps out. And even if you don't join as a member, thank you for your support, whether liking, subscribing, sharing, whatever it is you do. It's all important. But those memberships, the members are going to get lots of cool stuff exclusive only to them.
Smash that like button if you like Needless Things.